One of the services that people moving to a new community wanted for their families was a place to worship, or churches. In the very beginning, there were no church buildings in Tustin at all. For people in the community to gather to worship, they had to meet in a schoolhouse or perhaps even upstairs in a room above one of the stores in downtown Tustin. The population was slowly growing, so by the middle of the 1800s, Tustin finally had 3 churches. The first church that started in Tustin was the Advent Christian Church. It started in 1881. The chapel was actually completed in 1881. The wooden pews or benches that are used in the church came in a ship that sailed around the Cape Horn, which is at the very bottom of South America. The church is still in use today. In fact, it is the oldest continuously used church in all of Orange County. St. Paul's Episcopal Church was the second church, also built about 1881. At the very first worship service, it was said that it was so crowded you could hardly get inside the door. The building was finally moved to Santa Ana in 1902. The Tustin Presbyterian Church was started in about 1882, but before they even built their own chapel, they met in the afternoons in the Advent Christian Church. Across the street from the Hughes home was Fresnicker's Saloon. Well, Mrs. Hughes didn't like looking at or hearing all the noise from the saloon. She thought it would be far better to have a church there instead of a saloon. So she had her husband, David Hughes, buy the property. He had the saloon torn down and then donated the property on which a wooden church was built in 1884. Mr. Hughes also donated the church bell, which had previously been used on a train locomotive. In 1928, the Tustin Presbyterian Church built a new building in the Mediterranean or Spanish Revival style. Instead of tearing down the old original wooden church, they gave it to the Advent Christian Church, just down the street. In those days, the buildings didn't have any electrical wires for lights or any plumbing, so they weren't attached to the ground. Buildings were basically just wooden boxes, so it was very easy to move them. And that's exactly what they did. They raised the little wooden building up and rolled some large tree trunks that had been cut down underneath it. And then they rolled the little church down the street. It was added on to the Advent Christian Church to make it bigger. Both of these buildings still exist today. Today we're going to talk about Tustin's early pioneers. You probably know that a pioneer is a person who is one of the first to move to an area or to do something first. Well, today I'm only going to highlight a few of Tustin's pioneers, but of course there are many, many more that you can learn about too. We'll start with Columbus Tustin, the founder of Tustin, who is definitely a pioneer because he was the very first person to settle here. Today, Columbus Tustin Middle School and Tustin High School are both named after him. Lysander Utt came to Tustin in 1874 with his wife Emily and their son Charles Edward. He owned and operated the Utt Pioneer Store on the corner of Main and D Street, where the family even lived upstairs. Today we have grocery stores, hardware stores, shoe stores, etc. But the Pioneer Store had a little bit of everything, where people in the community could buy a variety of goods, from food to shoes or boots to tools and even fabric to sew their clothes. Charles Edward Utt, or C.E. Utt, was 8 years old when he came to Tustin with his parents, probably about the age of a third grader. He ended up having a big role in turning Tustin into a real city. One reason he is important to Tustin history is because he owned the Tustin Waterworks Company. Of course, water is a needed service for a community to survive, both for the daily use of the people in their homes, as well as important for their crops and animals. C.E. was also a rancher who planted crops of grapes called vineyards in the hills of Tustin. Because he had so many grapes, he started a juice company on his back porch and then moved it to downtown Tustin. The Ut Juice Company, which was on the corner of Prospect and Main Street for many years, not only made grape juice, but also other juices and even jams. Here in the museum, you can even see the Ut Juice Company sign. Today, Ut Middle School is named in his honor. George Preble came to Tustin in 1876 and built his home on one of the free lots which Columbus Tustin was giving away. Many years later, the property became a small shopping center in downtown Tustin, and it's called Jamestown Village. You may have seen the tiny church that only holds a few people, which was built in the middle of the parking lot. George Preble also designed and built a large 3-story hotel to try to get people to come visit Tustin and maybe decide to move here. David Hughes was a successful businessman from San Francisco. He moved to Tustin in 1881 to provide better weather for his wife, who was often ill from the damp air in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is famous for donating the golden spike that joined the final tracks of the Transcontinental Railroad in the ceremony in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah. He was probably the wealthiest man in Tustin at that time. His large home still stands today on the corner of Main Street and B Street. Hughes Middle School is even named in his honor. Charles Bowman originally owned the land that Tustin High School was built on. He was also a pioneer fumigator who owned a business which sprayed the orchards to get rid of the pests. Mrs. James Rice, or Coraline, is our next pioneer. Did you know in the late 1800s and early 1900s, women often were only referred to using their husband's name? Well, the Rice family moved to Tustin in 1877 to take advantage of a free lot on which to build their house. They also bought 50 acres and planted grapes and oranges. Coraline Rice entertained the community with her expert piano playing and her beautiful voice. She became known as the sweet songbird of Tustin. James and Coraline's son, Percy Rice, was very creative. He invented an automatic paper feeder for printing presses. He invented a push button for radios in the 1920s. And he even invented windshield wipers for glasses. I don't think that invention ever became very popular. This is Martha Snow. She married businessman and rancher Sherman Stevens, so she became known as Mrs. Stevens. Her husband, Sherman Stevens, grew oranges and grapes for raisins and later owned a lumber yard. He had redwood shipped from Northern California to build a beautiful home for his bride, Martha. His lumber company provided the lumber for many people to build their homes in both Tustin and Santa Ana. The Stevens house still stands today on Main Street.
Okay.
This is a picture of Dr. James Boyd. Tustin's first doctor was Dr. Sheldon, but after Dr. Sheldon died, Dr. James Boyd took over for him. He had been a doctor in Santa Ana, but he now became Tustin's doctor also. He took over the office that Dr. Sheldon left for him on D Street, which is now called El Camino Real. It's a little red building you can still see in downtown Tustin today. These are two of Tustin's pioneers, John W. Sowers and his wife Hazel. John Sowers and his brother Charles moved here around 1896. John grew apricots and walnuts on his ranch. Charles owned the Sowers and Berquist Market and was also the first clerk at Tustin High School in 1921. Laureen Sowers, John's daughter, was the very first graduating class in Tustin High School in 1923. This family has been in Tustin for many generations, and now, almost 125 years later, the Sowers family is still active in Tustin today. Of course, there have been many more Tustin pioneers through the years. Your school may be even named after one of our Tustin pioneers or community leaders, such as Robert Heidemann, Benjamin Beswick, Helen Estock, or Gwen Foss, or even W.R. Nelson.
Hi everyone, the section of the Tustin Area Museum we're in right now is the Agriculture and Early Business section. When Columbus Tustin started his Tustin City, the main job of most families was centered around agriculture. Now, agriculture is the business of farming crops and raising animals to provide food and other products. Columbus Tustin and his family started out by planting vegetables, while a lot of the other families that came in the early days planted crops like grapes, apples, and peach trees. However, the water for the crops was kind of hard to come by in those early 1870s. It wasn't until the Santa Ana Valley Irrigation Company was organized that Tustin actually got its fair share of water for the crop irrigation. Now, 10 years after Tustin started, 1880, Tustin ranchers found out which crops didn't really grow so well on the flatlands and which ones flourished. So out came most of the grapes and all the apple and peach trees, and in went crops like apricots, peanuts, walnuts, oranges, and lemons. Now, a little side note here. Even though grapes didn't grow very well here on the flatlands, they did grow well up in the foothills where it had the cooler night air. And so in the area of Lemon Heights, we know that grape crops were doing very well because one of our early pioneers, C.E. Utt, had quite a few acres of grape vineyards, and he made some homemade grape juice. And he started to have so much grape juice from his bumper crop that he started sharing it with friends. I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but because of all this wonderful success with grapes, he started the Juice Company. Now that we had plentiful water and the right crops in the ground, Tustin really took off as an agricultural center. And it didn't take very long for ranchers to learn that citrus crops like oranges and lemons grew especially well in our area. And having these right crops in the ground created lots of jobs for the people who were moving here to Tustin. We needed people who not only took care of the trees, but people who picked the crops, washed the crops, and then packed them and got them ready for shipment to stores. One of the most important jobs in these citrus orchards took place when the night weather fell below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Because when it fell that low, the cold air would freeze the fruit, which would then damage it and make it inedible for eating. So to protect fruit trees from frost damage, farmers used this item right over here. If you take a look over here, this is called a smudge pot. And this is actually a lighter for the smudge pot. So in the middle of the night, when the temperature fell to 28 degrees or lower, they would light the smudge pots. And here you can see a picture. There's actually snow on the ground. And you can see these smudge pots went in between the rows of the citrus orchards. And they would light these smudge pots at night. And the reason they were called smudge pots is because they really didn't create fire as much as they created smoke. And the smoke was like a warm blanket that would surround the trees in the orchard. And it would keep the fruit warm until the sun came up the next day and the temperatures rose. And it protected the fruit from the cold air. Now, you don't want to talk to the school children who ended up with smudge all over their faces as they walked to school in the morning. But the smudge pots were a big part of protecting the crops here in Tustin. Okay, over here you can see these very large bags that were used when they picked the fruit off of the trees. And you can imagine how heavy these must have been as they had these slung over their shoulder as these got packed with heavy fruit. Now, if you look over here, you'll see a picture of where the fruit would go after it was picked. It would go over to the packing house. And at the packing house, they would wash the fruit, they would select the good fruit, and then pack them into crates. And here you see a picture of the women sorting them, probably by size and selection, and putting them into the wooden crates. We actually have a sample of the wooden crates here, and you can see how many pieces of fruit it would hold. I'm sure they were very heavy. And then, of course, one of the final things they did when they were done packing the fruit is they would put the label of the company. This is a fruit packing box label for this particular company. Here's another one for Seven Hills. And here's another one for Valencia Rangers. There's even one on the wall here for a company that was the Orange County Valencias, and it had the name Tustana. I think that's pretty nice because it had the name of Tustin in the fruit label. People even collect these fruit labels today because they're no longer being made. And in fact, the Tustin Area Museum will sell copies of these prints if you or your family are interested in them. They are very highly prized collectible items. Over here, you can see an aerial picture of the packing houses in Tustin in the early 1950s. You can see that in this part of Tustin, almost the entire city was filled with fruit orchards of one kind or another. To give you some landmarks as to where this picture is, right here you'll see a very long street, and that is Newport Boulevard that is still there today. This street right here is Holt Avenue. And you can see that there were some very large packing houses all along the way. This one right here is the Tustin Hills Citrus Association. To its right is the Central Lemon Association packing house. And then across the street, across on Newport, we have the Golden West Citrus Association. Now, if you think about what we have there today, right about here is where the Albertsons Market is. And if you just go up a little bit, right where these orchards were, that's where Ruby's Restaurant is. I'm sure a lot of you know about that restaurant. But you can see that this was the focus in the 1950s. It was an agricultural center focused mostly on the citrus industry. And as a little girl, when my family moved here in 1962, this is what I remember. As far as my eyes could see, there were citrus orchards. And you could see it was from one end of Tustin to the other. But as Tustin grew and more houses were being built, citrus groves gave way to new homes in the city, and the agriculture focus moved to other jobs. Now, this building might look familiar to you. Do you know that in the year 1885, it was the first doctor's office in Tustin? It was the office of Dr. James Sheldon. And then later in the 1950s, it was known as a very fashionable store called the Jabberwocky, and young girls could get their dresses there. Of course, today, you may know it as the home of Zama Tea. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the other early businesses in the city of Tustin because we know that not everybody in Tustin was a farmer or a rancher. So what were some of those early businesses? Well, one of them was this particular building right here. This was known as the Pioneer Store, and it was started by Lysander Utt. It stood at the corner of Main and D Streets, and Mr. Utt ran this Pioneer Store until 1891. Next, we see the Tustin Blacksmith Shop. And it was a place where you could take your tools to get them sharpened or repaired. It was also a place where you would get the horseshoes made for your horses, or even a place where they could fix carriage wheels for wagons, because of course this was in the day before cars. I'd like you to focus here on the left side of this picture. This was a very well-known bank in the city of Tustin. At first it was called the Bank of Tustin. It was opened in 1888 at the corner of Main and D Streets. And of course we know that D Street right here was later called El Camino Real. Later on it became known as the First National Bank in 1911. Wasn't it an absolutely beautiful building? Unfortunately, in 1933, we had a very large earthquake here in Orange County, and they had to take off a lot of this fancy work that you see along the sides of the building, and it became a much plainer building, but stayed in business until it was torn down in the 1960s. Later, in the 1900s, another important business was developed in Tustin. This is the Tustin Hardware Store, and it was established in 1912. Here you could find all kinds of household items or things for the yard. And the store served the city of Tustin until fairly recently, 1990. That's a long time to be in business. This was also a very popular place for the ranchers to meet at the end of their long day, and they would sometimes sit around the potbelly stove in the back of the store and talk about the happenings of their day. After cars came into being and cars came through Tustin, the Tustin Garage business began. It was the very first Tustin garage and gas station in the city of Tustin, and later on 9 others were built. But in the beginning, this was the major stop where people would stop along the way between their travels between the cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. And back then, D Street was actually part of Highway 101. Did you know that Highway 101 came right through the middle of Tustin? And then later in the 1960s, our mayor, Tony Coco, had it named for historical value and named it El Camino Real on the 100th anniversary of Tustin's founding. And it is still called El Camino Real today. Of course, one of the largest employers in the city of Tustin was the Ut Juice Company, and I told you a little bit about it on the other part of the film. This business was started by Mr. Charles Edward Ut, and he made juices, jams, jellies, and syrup used in locally grown crops. It started when he started making juice from his own crops that he grew up in Lemon Heights. It became so popular when he shared it with friends that they told him he should sell it commercially. And that's exactly what he did. And thus the Ut Juice Company started in the year 1918. If we take a look at this case over here, we can see some very prized remnants from the Ut Juice Company. Later on, as his company became much more successful, we see that they changed the name from the Ut Juice, and they changed it to the Queen Isabella label, which was very, very popular. We see here a bottle of Concord grape juice, some blackberry jam. They even made orange marmalade and raspberry jam. And then when Walter Knott had his farm over in Buena Park, they even made some of the boysenberry juice and boysenberry jam for Mr. Knott. It was quite a successful company in the city of Tustin. Here are some other interesting items from the early businesses in Tustin. Now this ancient relic right here is known as the typewriter. It's what people used for typing letters and documents in the days before personal computers were invented. But the main difference here is that you actually type from these keys and it goes directly onto the paper. There was no need for a printer back in those days. This was it. And some folks, myself included, even took typing classes in our high schools in order to learn how to type well. Over here, we have some very old cash registers that were used in our early businesses. So of course, people only used cash back then. There was no such thing as Venmo or a credit card or Apple Cash. So you used that green stuff and the things that we call coins. And they would have to transact and make change when the customer gave them more money than they owed. Here's another cash register. This one came from the Ut Juice Company, and it was used from about 1930 until the year 1973. And here you see they had the ability to lock up the cash at night. Now right below that, you can see a time-stamp clock that the employees at Ut Juice Company used. And the handle is turned to the correct hour and minute. And they would do this on a card when they started work, and then they would change it to the time when they ended, and they would stamp it a second time. And that was how bosses knew exactly how long their employees worked. As we walk over to the front of the museum, you can see this very enormous sign that has been lifted above the entrance to the museum. And it is the original sign that hung over the Ut Juice Company. And you can see here it talks about the Queen Isabella grape juice and that it is the queen of drinks. Isn't that great that they have that relic here in the museum? If we go over and look at the front window of the museum, we see there are some other relics from the early businesses of Tustin. For example, here, this very large metal object is a farm plow. And of course, it would be attached to horses from this end, and then the farmer would be behind it holding onto the handles here. And as the horses moved, the plow would dig a large and straight row in order to plant crops. Now behind that, this was used in the dairy business. This is called a cream separator. You may have heard the old saying that the cream will rise to the top. And sure enough, when they would take milk after milking the cows, the milk solids would stay in the bottom, but the cream solids would rise to the top. And so this cream separator had a couple of different spouts. And in one spout would go the milk that was at the bottom, and the one that was at the top would take the cream and put it in a separate container. A very clever invention for separating milk from cream. If we look at the very, very back of the window, this is a Toledo scale that would measure the local feed that people would get for their animals. So someone might get a bag of oats and they would weigh it and see how much they would have to pay. You paid based on the weight of what you bought. They could also sometimes buy a bag of seeds in order to plant crops, and that again was sold by weight. This gives you just a glimpse of some of the tools used in the agriculture and early businesses in the early days of Tustin. And we know, of course, Tustin has changed from an agricultural center to more modern day businesses, stores, and restaurants.
Now we're going to talk about the homes in early Tustin. Of course, when people moved to Tustin, and especially if they got a free lot from Columbus Tustin, they now needed to build a home on it. If you drive around Tustin today in Old Town Tustin, you'll see a variety of old homes. Many of the early homes in Tustin were small, simple cottages built from wood, similar to this one. In the surrounding areas, there were farmhouses scattered in the fields or tucked into the orchards. They were also built from wood and would usually be fairly simple. You could tell how important someone was in a community by the size of their home. If you were very wealthy, you might have had a larger home. Well, very popular in the late 1800s were Victorian-style homes, named after Queen Victoria of England. They were usually larger, but they were also built from wood and may have had fancy trims and moldings. If you drive around in the neighborhoods of downtown Tustin, see if you can find a house with a turret or a tower, a house with stained glass or colored glass windows, maybe a house with wood on the side that looks like fish scales, or even a house with a large wraparound porch. These were fashionable styles of the day. An excellent example of a Victorian-style home is this one. This is the Stevens home. When Mr. Stevens built his home for his bride, he had the redwood lumber to build his house shipped from Northern California. The Hughes house is an example of another style of home that was also popular at that time, called the Greek Revival style. It was modeled after ancient Greek temples. This style is simple, usually painted white to look like marble, and often uses columns on the porch. The Hughes house was later owned by Benjamin Beswick, who was the superintendent of the schools in Tustin. In those days, women teachers were not allowed to get married, so Mr. Beswick had the roof of his house raised up and had a second story added, which he turned into rooms where the teachers lived. That way he could make sure they didn't go on dates and then get married. He didn't want to have to hire a new teacher. To Today, homes are built using round nails made by a machine so they can all be the same size. The two nails on the left are typical nails that are used today. But an interesting fact is that wooden homes built in the 1800s were built using square nails, like the nail on the right. They were usually made by the local blacksmith who pounded a small piece of metal into a nail shape so it could be driven into wood. They weren't exactly square, but close enough. This square nail actually came from the Hughes house when they were replacing the roof a few years ago. Craftsman bungalow-style homes became popular around World War I and share Main Street even with the Victorian-style homes. They were made of natural materials and earth colors. Brick and stone was used to build large columns that supported the roofs of big porches that usually covered the entire front of the house. In the 1920s, Spanish-style homes became very popular. These were built with white or tan painted stucco walls and red clay or tile roofs. They usually had arches and curves and were decorated with iron window grills or iron gates. Throughout the neighborhoods in downtown Tustin, you can see many small examples of these Spanish-style homes. A beautiful large example of a Spanish-style home sits on Main Street. Its stucco walls are almost 2 feet thick, which helps keep the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter. If you live in the Tustin Ranch area, you may even live in a Spanish-style house or an apartment complex where this style is again very popular today. We also have several large doll houses that were donated to the museum. They are examples of early Tustin homes, such as the Victorian house up on the left, or the early adobe Rancho period house on the right. Now you're an expert on the styles of early Tustin homes.